Hello everybody! As a Magic player, you're constantly exposed to the MTG mana system, and usually it comes up in a negative kind of way, like, I drew too many lands, I drew too few lands, you got so lucky, I was so unlucky, and so on. And I wanted to explore this mana system in a more general and overview way, and compare it to different card games, see what it does well, see what it doesn't do well, see why it has endured, even there are lots of complaints about it, and does it still hold up? So without further ado, let's go. So today I want to talk about different card games and their resource systems. Usually card games obviously are designed around their resource systems. It doesn't really matter which card game you play, Lorcana, Hearthstone, Yu-Gi-Oh, whatever it might be, Magic the Gathering obviously. You have different kinds of resource systems in different games. Resource systems usually have some advantages and disadvantages, and I'm going to talk about these as well, specifically with the focus on Magic the Gathering. You have an increased variance on how games go, depending on how many lands you draw, because they are in your deck. So Mana Screw and Mana Flood will be discussed over the course of these slides. And Mana Screw and Mana Flood are the main cause for most of the bad play experiences in Magic the Gathering. I will also talk about the advantages of the MTG mana system. And here I will mainly argue that it offers a huge freedom and variety in deck construction without any artificial card restrictions like they are employed in many other games. The colors provide identities. They are kind of like your class system or your hero system that you see in other card games, without putting up these artificial restrictions that other games do. I will also explore a little bit how you can use the mana system as a little bit of a comeback potential. There's a semi-comeback mechanic in there, but well, we're gonna see that I'm not holding these positive aspects in too much of high regard. We'll see later. Also, playing around Screw and Flood is also a skill that you can develop, and you can learn to deal with Screw and Flood as you get stronger as a player. And the last point that I want to show today, and I've not seen a lot of discussion around this, is how does the MTG mana system impact the MTG limited format, so draft and sealed. And I will argue that this is one of the main reasons that the draft and sealed environment in Magic the Gathering is so good when compared to other games. In my opinion, MTG offers the best draft and sealed experience, and I will argue that this is due to the mana system. Okay, here we go. So the resource systems are fundamental for play and feel of a game. It doesn't matter, Lorcana, Magic the Gathering, whatever you play, the resource system determines how the games play out. And there are lots of resource systems out there. So how do the designers of these games choose which one to use? Well, they want to achieve different goals. Any given card game wants to achieve a different goal. So do you want to have a very complex card game? Do you want to have a more casual experience? Do you want to have a lot of variety? Is this your primary aspect? Do you want to have a very fast format, a very slow format, or a game in this case? So depending on what the goal of a given card game is, you should use a different mana system. Card games are designed around their resource system. What does that mean? It means that cards are balanced with the resource system in mind. For example, here is a Magic the Gathering card, Divination. It draws 2 cards when you play it, and it costs a total of 3 mana. It needs 2 generic mana, so mana of any kind, and 1 blue mana. And what that means we'll learn later, but keep in mind this is 3 mana. So if you have a stronger effect, you want to draw more cards, well, you gotta increase the price, of course. So this is opportunity. You draw 4 cards instead of 2 cards, and you draw twice as many cards, so opportunity costs twice as much. It also offers some design spaces depending on which mana system you use, cards can interact with the resource system. For example, here is an example from Hearthstone. Wild Growth, it costs 2 mana in order to play it, and you gain an empty mana crystal. So you jump ahead 1 turn. Or here, for example, the card Lightning Bolt costs 1 mana for 3 damage. You can deal 3 damage for 1 mana, which is very powerful and above the curve. But it comes with a little downside. Overload 1 means that 1 of your mana crystals cannot be used on the next turn. All resource systems have certain advantages and disadvantages, and I want to argue that there is no universally best resource system, but rather a best resource system to achieve the goals of your design. Well, let's have a look at some of these resource systems. For example, let's start with Hearthstone. Hearthstone has a relatively simple mana system. You gain 1 mana crystal per turn. These are the mana crystals, these blue dots here, and each turn you gain an additional mana crystal, up to 10. You use these mana crystals in order to play your cards. So cards use a certain amount of your crystal that you have available on your turn. For example, this Murloc Tidecaller requires 1 mana crystal and is a 1/2 Murloc. So if you have a creature that requires 4 mana crystals in order to be played, this Chillwind Yeti, you would expect it to be more powerful. And indeed it is. This is a 4/5. This kind of mana system, where you don't have to do anything, you know that you will get 1 additional mana crystal each turn, has very little impact on your deck construction. Of course, you have to adhere to the basic rules. You want to have like a certain curve. You want to have spells that you can play on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3, depending on the deck you play. But other than that, you don't really have to think a lot about the mana system. The cards that you can play for your class, you can just put them in, and on turn 4, you can play any 4-drop. The effect that this kind of mana system also has is it ramps up the complexity. What that means is that usually in the beginning, there are very few decisions that you have to make. You look at your hand, and there is maybe 1 card that you can play, like this Murloc Tidecaller. So you know, on turn 1, you will play the Murloc Tidecaller. There's not a lot of complexity there. But the more turns go by and the more mana crystals you have available, it becomes more complex. On board, depending on how the situation currently is, are you ahead, are you behind, do you need to deal with a certain creature of your opponent, and so on. But also in your hand, on turn 4, do you play the Chillwind Yeti, or do you play 2 cards that have mana value 2? Interestingly, for a game that is very high on variance in its actual cards, the actual mana system is very consistent. You know, you will get 1 mana crystal each turn. And this is, of course, by design. The developers of Hearthstone said, look, for us, the fun part should be you play your spells. Casting your spells is the most fun. Don't worry about the mana system, neither in deck construction nor in gameplay. You will know when to play it. Minimal effort, spend minimal mental bandwidth on your mana system. Just play your cards, have fun. This in turn also means that you have a limited design space. We saw some cards that interact with the mana system, and they did a pretty good job with that in order to explore this design space, but there's not a whole lot that you can do. And you don't have to. Let's have a look at Lorcana. Many cards of Lorcana can be placed face down as ink, and this ink can then be used as mana to pay for cards. When we have a look at one of these cards, this is Lilo, and in the top left corner you can see her cost. It costs 1. Not all of the cards can be placed down as ink. For example, Hans here can, and this is indicated by this yellow circle around the mana cost. So, cards with this circle, throw them to your opponent, you place them down, and you can use them as mana. Cards are associated with ink color, but ink can be used for all cards. So, Hilo, you see, has this ember color, and Hans has this emerald color. You can use any ink that you have on the board to pay for Lilo. It doesn't have to come from a yellow card that you put face down. You can put down Hans on the first turn and pay for Lilo with the mana or the ink that he produces. However, you can only have 2 of these colors in your deck, at least in construct. So there is a certain restriction. This, of course, factors into deck construction. Which cards do I want to have that can be put down as ink? Which 2 colors do I choose? Which 2 colors work well together? And how do I construct my deck in order to be able to play all my cards? This also, during gameplay, leads to this ramp-up complexity. In the beginning, you have very few decisions to make, but later on in the game, you have more ink available, and that, of course, translates to more options that you have. It is a mostly consistent resource. Of course, there are draws, particularly if your deck is poorly constructed, where you draw only cards that you cannot place down as ink, or where you draw cards that you did not want to put down as ink because they are very central to your strategy. But of course, there is some design space there that the designers can play with. Which cards do they make inkable? Which ones do they not make inkable? And the cards that are not inkable, at least this is what I would assume, can be a little bit more powerful because they are less flexible. And the final example of a resource system I want to discuss before going to Magic the Gathering is Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a traditional resource that we have seen in the other games. There is no cost to a card, usually. At least generally. For example, Pot of Greed here draws you 2 cards. You can just play it. You have it in hand, you play it, you draw 2 cards. Some of the cards do have requirements, so you need to tribute, that means sacrifice monsters that you have in play, or combine certain cards in order to be able to play them. So this creates some sort of cost, but usually if you have a card in hand, you can just play it. So this, as there is no traditional cost system here, has very little impact on deck construction. Of course, if you're playing a certain archetype, you need to make sure that you have, like, if you're playing Link Summons, then you need a certain type of card in order to play out your bigger cards. And this, of course, plays into your deck construction. But other than that, there is no restriction on the cards that you can use. This leads, of course, to a high complexity in gameplay. Because the cards that you play are not limited or don't have a lot of requirements, usually you can play your entire hand. If you construct your deck in a certain way, then you can play all the cards in your hand. And you can draw additional cards and play these cards as well, and so on. And this leads to a very high complexity from the first turn on in Yu-Gi-Oh! You have some design space with this system, because as I told you, sometimes you need to tribute monsters, or you need to have a certain amount of monster on the field and have a certain card to combine it with. So this leads to some design space to play with for the designers. But other than that, there's no real restriction. And this leads Yu-Gi-Oh! To be one of the, I would say, fastest or at least most complex games out there. Okay, so how does the Magic the Gathering resource system square up against these? Well, how does it work? In Magic, you have dedicated resource cards, lands, in your deck. You can play 1 land a turn and tap these lands to provide a colored mana to pay for your spell. Let's have a look at the card opportunity again, because cards have specific color requirements in order to be played. Opportunity costs 6, we learned this before, and you need 2 blue mana for this and 4 generic. Generic mana can be paid with anything that you can provide. This, of course, has a huge impact on deck construction. Because not only do you need to consider which cards do I put into my deck, but you also have to consider which mana sources do I need to put into my deck in order to be able to consistently play all of my cards. This also leads to this ramp-up complexity that we have discussed with Hearthstone, that we have discussed with Lorcana. So in the beginning, you have very few options to play, but later on, you have more complex decisions to make. The land system also provides a huge design space, because lands can actually have some effects and abilities. So this is Bajuka Borg, for example. It enters the battlefield tapped, so you cannot use it on the turn that you play it. It adds a black when you tap it, so it's a swamp that comes into play tapped. But in order to compensate for it coming into play tapped, it gets an ability. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Also, included in this design space is that you can account for power level of cards in their color requirements. This is Centaur Courser. It has 3 power and 3 toughness, and it requires 3 mana, a green one, and 2 generic. Well, this is Watchwolf. It is also a 3/3, and it only requires 2 mana. But it needs specifically 1 green and 1 white. So, this is harder to cast than the Centaur Courser because it needs these specific 2 mana. But if you are able to consistently provide a green and a white mana on turn 2, then you will always want to play Watchwolf over the Centaur Courser. This is a more powerful card than Centaur Courser, but it is more difficult to cast. As you draw your lands, you need to draw them from your deck, and this can lead to larger variance in games. And this is what I'm gonna discuss next. Mana Flood is one of them. Lands usually have a very low impact on the game. We saw Bajuka Borg. It had an ability that influences the game, but it does not kill your opponent. So, if you have a lot of cards that have a very low impact on the game, like lands, then you have fewer impactful spells available than your opponent. And the person who plays more impactful spells usually wins the duel. This leads to games like this. This is an opening hand that I drew. You can see there are only lands in there. There is nothing that I can do. I cannot put pressure on my opponent. I cannot kill my opponent with this hand. So there are games where you don't find the tools needed to actually compete in the game. And this is, of course, a very bad play experience. Mana Screw is the opposite. If you look at this hand, I don't have any lands at all. So I cannot play any spells. So I would rely on drawing lands from my deck over the next few turns in order to play these cards. Other than that, if I cannot do that, then I cannot play in the game. Color Screw is similar to this. This is a hand where I have only blue spells, but only lands that produce white mana. So I cannot currently play any of these blue spells until I draw an island or another source that produces blue mana. So these last 2 examples would lead to games where I cannot play out any cards and I cannot compete in the game. I cannot play the game without any fault of my own, just due to variance, just due to having an unlucky draw. I cannot play a single card that impacts the game. This is, of course, a huge downside of this mana system. But what do you gain? Well, I'm gonna go through a few points, and I ranked them basically in inverse powerful order. So one of the things that I see discussed online a lot is that it provides a semi-comeback mechanic. So if you fall behind and you feel like all hope is lost, no, there is always hope. There is the hope that your opponent might flood out, draw nothing than lands. They have 5 cards in hand, maybe it's all lands. Maybe they can't do anything. You can always come back if your opponent has a bad enough draw. And as players of all skill levels fall victim to this Screw and Flood, you can actually win against much stronger opponents. It doesn't matter. I'm sitting across a pro player. I'm sitting across the world champion. Well, if they screw, if they flood, then I can win the game. I don't really think that's a huge boon of this system. And I would hesitate to imagine that if the Magic designers were presented with the choice, well, you can have this comeback mechanic, it requires one of the players to not play the game. I think they would really advocate for this option to be in the game. I would argue that this is just a side effect of the mana system and not an intended bonus. A little stronger of an argument, I think, is that playing with and around Screw and Flood is a skill that can be relatively rewarding. So the better you get, the better you will be able to deal with Flood and Screw. You will start mapping out certain lines. How can I still come back into this game? What is required? And play to your outs. So stronger players will be able to overcome Screw and Flood a lot better than newer players. And this can be very rewarding. Again, I would argue this is rather a side effect and not really an intended bonus. But it is definitely rewarding, and it leads to a better consistency of the higher skilled player actually winning the duel. One of the arguments I see, which I think holds some water, is that it increases design space. There are mechanics to alleviate some issues. For example, you can take a mulligan. If you don't like your opening hand, you can put it back, draw a hand of 7 cards, and then basically with each mulligan you reduce the number of cards that you have available. But you can at least guarantee, or at least give you a chance of playing the game. Other mechanics include dual lands. So for example, this is Steam Vents. It's a land, and it produces either blue or red mana. So once you play it, you have access to blue and red mana. There is of course a downside. When you play it, you can decide whether you want to use it immediately. Then you have to pay 2 life, so it deals 2 damage to you. Or you can just have it come into play tapped, so that means you cannot use it this turn. So it either slows you down or it damages you, but it provides you with 2 different colors of mana. Cycling is another mechanic. Here, for example, is Lonely Sandbar. It has cycling for 1 blue, so you can pay 1 blue mana, discard this card, and draw a new one. So if you already have enough lands in play, you can just exchange this Lonely Sandbar for the card on top of your library, which is hopefully a spell that wins you the game. There is Scrying, there's Surveilling, which means you can look at the top of your card of your deck, and if you see a land when you don't need one, you can discard it or put it on the bottom of your deck. Or if you need a land, then you can discard spells, whatever is needed for you at this time. And this can also reduce Screw and Flood. Also, there are other mechanics like Morph, for example, where this card, for example, requires 2 and a blue in order to play this as an 0/5. But if you don't have blue mana available, you can play this on turn 3 as a 2/2. These kinds of mechanics are specifically designed to reduce Screw and Flood on the game. And I would argue that some of these are the most beloved mechanics in the entire game due to this reason. Another design space that opens up are on the lands themselves. We saw it earlier with the Bajuka Bog, that lands actually can have abilities. Here, for example, Thespian Stage can copy any land, and this can actually lead to some archetypes even. There's a lands archetype that is played in some formats. For example, these 2 cards, they combine, and when they are combined, they produce a huge indestructible flyer that can kill your opponent in 1. So, increased design space is one huge benefit. Another thing, due to these colors, do provide identity. Because what they did from the not from the beginning, but very early on, is the so-called color pie. different colors of mana are given certain characteristics, which are then reflected in the ability of the cards in this color. I will give some example here for each color. Red has this impulsiveness, so they will sacrifice long-term staying power for a short-term gain. For example, this is Pyretic Ritual. It costs 2 mana and creates 3 mana. So you will go up 1 mana with this card, but you sacrifice a card. Black is associated with ambition, for example. So they will look for power even to the point of self-sacrificing something of them. For example, here is Sign in Blood. It costs 2 black mana, and target player, usually it's yourself, draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. So you get a very powerful draw spell effect, but you sacrifice 2 life. White is associated with community, usually small creatures working together. This is Resolute Reinforcement, a 2 mana 1/1 creature, and you can play it at any time. And when it enters, it comes with a small 1/1 friend. So you have 1 card and it creates 2 creatures on the board. Divination is in blue. Blue is associated with intellect, for example, accumulating knowledge by drawing cards. This is a similar card that we have seen with Sign in Blood. It's a little bit more expensive. It draws 2 cards, but it doesn't come with a downside of damaging you. And finally, green is associated with growth. Here, for example, is Rampant Growth. It's 2 mana, and you can search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So this lets you ramp. Ramping is actually called after this card. Ramp up to higher mana values earlier in the game. And if you are consistent in designing cards along these veins, then you can give each color a certain identity. And that means that certain players will prefer some colors over the others. And not only that, you can then combine the colors. Even color pairs and triplets are given characters. I think the most popular and consistent are the color pairs. For example, here we have Skylight Legionnaire. It requires a red and a white mana. And the red and white combination is called Boros and is associated with aggression. And you can see it's a 2/2 flyer with haste, so it can attack immediately when it's being played. So if you have a lot of cards along these veins, then you can build a very aggressive deck. Why would you want to combine colors? Well, not only do these have strength, of course, they also then have weaknesses. So in order to balance out some weaknesses, you want to combine colors so that the second color can cover for the weakness of the first color. Along all of these, it is more or less guaranteed that you will find a color pair, or a color triplet that resonates very strongly with you. And usually every single Magic the Gathering player has a favorite color combination or a favorite color. And all of this is just by clever card design without any artificial risk. Speaking of restrictions, this is also something that does not come up when you look at the deck construction. You have the ultimate freedom and variety in deck construction. The Magic the Gathering mana system promises you get to play any card and even any combination of cards that you can dream of in your deck. You have to work for it, and it might make your deck a little bit less consistent, but whatever cards you want to play, you can play. Well, if you can play any card and any combination of cards, how do you prevent a situation where everybody is just looking at the powerful cards and just picking the most powerful cards, and then all the decks will be the same? Well, you still have a lot of variety due to the land system, because deck construction is an art form in Magic the Gathering. Because by adding colors to a deck, you usually increase the power, but you sacrifice consistency. Due to these negative effects that we have discussed earlier, like color screw. You add additional colors, well, there are games that you just don't draw the right amount of colors. And this is a downside that you have to consider during deck construction. Do I really need this powerful card that is in a different color? Or can I do with another effect that is maybe similar or maybe different in the colors that I'm currently already playing? And looking for these powerful combinations can be very rewarding. Sometimes you say, yes, I definitely need to combine these cards. Yes, it is worth it to combine these cards. For example, this blue card and this red card, they combine to a combination that is infinite, and when it's not immediately answered by the opponent, it will just win you the game with an infinite number of tokens that attack your opponent for infinite damage. These cards were designed years apart from each other. So there was no like specific, oh, this wants to combine with this. No, it was just players looked at these cards and saw, wow, what if I combine this card with this card that was printed years ago? And all of a sudden they found a very powerful combination, and Magic the Gathering tells you, yes, you can play these cards together. Unless the combination is too powerful and one or both of these cards get banned. And then figuring out how to build your land base to optimally support these cards, this is the true skill. Which lands do I need to play? How many lands do I need to play? How do I make sure that I can actually cast my spells? How do other card games do it? The examples we have discussed mostly use a class and archetype restriction to introduce this character and variety. In Hearthstone, you have these different classes. You can play the warrior, but the warrior can only play with warrior cards and general cards. They cannot play with cards from other classes. Same goes for Flesh and Blood. Here's the example of Bolton. This is a light warrior, and he can only play with light and with warrior cards. So if you find a nice combination of your warrior card and a card from another class, tough luck, you can't play it. There is the exception of Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Also allows you to play any card you want. You can mix any cards together. But the lack of the traditional resource systems can lead to cards that are played in every deck. This then reduces the variety. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Introduces this character and variety via archetypes that work cards that work very well together. Well, as much as we have discussed the upsides of the MTG mana system, there is an issue. The biggest upside of the MTG mana system is felt during deck construction. So, how do I make sure that I can play all my cards? Only people that engage with the deck building aspect of Magic the Gathering will be really experiencing the freedom and the versatility of this mana system. The biggest downside, mana screw, mana flood, I cannot play the game and I can't do anything about it, is felt in gameplay. So that means everybody playing it is experiencing it. And I feel this gets overlooked a little bit, even by very experienced players. Sometimes I hear, well, I mean, it balances out. You just have to live with it. You get used to it. But consider when we have a really good game, Magic is such a great game. And I feel like a lot of even experienced players fail to convey what the actual upside of this mana system is. Because the average player, they will not see the benefit of the flexibility of the land system until they actually tinker with their deck, until they look at their deck and say, oh, I don't like how it plays against this certain matchup, so let's put in this card from another color. What do I do now? Do I put in additional lands? Do I swap out this color for another color? There is this flexibility, and once you start tinkering with it, you can see the real benefits of it. But it's unlikely that a new player is really worried about if their character of the deck comes from a class or from the color identities. Because for them, it's just a pile of cards, and they get to play with this pile of cards. And when you compare, for example, a game of Hearthstone, where you got to play your cards, you were behind the entire time, but it didn't matter. You played your cards, maybe you killed even some of the opponent's creatures. You were outclassed the entire game, but it didn't matter. You played your cards. You had some fun. Whereas in Magic, you just drew your hand. You couldn't do anything with it. You drew only lands afterwards. You didn't play the game. So, this is a really bad experience. To a point where I would even say that if a player is not interested in the deck building process and is frustrated by this Mana Screw, Mana Flood, there might actually be a better game out there that they enjoy more. But I can tell you, I'm not one of these players. And that is for a very specific reason. For me, the Magic the Gathering limited format is the best limited format across all the games that I have played. And that is to a huge degree due to the land system and the variety and the flexibility it offers. So let's talk about it. What is the limited format? We're talking about Booster Draft and Sealed Deck here, just quick for those uninitiated. Sealed Deck means you open 6 booster packs, you have a bunch of cards, and you pick the cards that you want to play with. You add any number of basic lands of any type that you want, and you construct a 40 card deck and battle against players that have done the same. Booster Draft is usually 8 players sit in a circle. You open 1 booster pack, you pick 1 card. You can see that on the right hand side here. You choose one of these cards, you pick that card and pass the rest to your neighbor. And you do this until you have drafted 3 full booster packs. And then you do the same as in Sealed Deck. You construct a 40 card deck from the cards you have drafted, and you add any number of basic lands. What does the mana system have to do with the enjoyment of this format? Well, obviously, the limited format forces you to engage with the deck building process. And this is where you can see the benefits from the land system, as we have discussed earlier. There are lots of decisions when you are selecting your cards. Which colors should you play? You open your 6 booster packs for the sealed pool, look at them. Which colors contain the best cards in my sealed deck pool? Which are the most powerful cards in it? Can I play them? Is there enough support in these colors? Or do I need to abandon my best cards in order to get a more consistent deck with removal, with a better curve, whatever? Or when drafting, after some time, some patterns emerge. Which colors do I see getting passed to me by my neighbors while drafting? If you see a pack like this coming around to you, there are only blue and red cards left. So maybe it might be beneficial for you to switch into red or blue and be rewarded with lots of cards coming your way that are opened later. Usually, a limited deck will consist of cards of 2 colors. And this immediately, due to the color system, provides you with 10 2-color combinations. And when designed well, and Wizards of the Coast have done a great job over the last decades of curating these decks and designing these decks for limited play, then you get 10 different archetypes that sometimes overlap, so you can mix and match cards. But that means that for every limited format, get at least 10 limited sessions until you have explored each archetype. The color restrictions and the land system also come into effect in another way. When I did a Lorcana draft, it was basically just pick the best cards, because the restriction that you have in constructed Lorcana does not apply for limited. So you can just play cards from any color and combine as many colors as you want. So that means you basically just pick the best card out of the pack. There is no consideration. The only consideration is what is the power level of the card. Maybe there's some synergy with what your strategy wants to do, but usually it's pick the best card. That is not quite as easy in Magic the Gathering drafts, and I think it adds another level of complexity which I like. Consider a draft. You're sitting down, you're starting to draft, and you end up in this awesome red and green color combination. And the cards are coming to you. You open your second pack, and there it is. There's a card staring at you which is so good and would add to the power level of your deck. But unfortunately, it's not red and green. It is green and blue. What do? Well, the mana system in Magic tells you, add it to your deck and then add lands of this color and you can play it. So you again have added power, but it comes at a cost of consistency. And navigating this and agonizing over it, can I support this card? How can I support this card? Is one of the most skill testing and most rewarding experience that you can have in draft. This process of adding another color, usually one card or two cards of another color into your deck for power consideration, is called splashing. In some formats, it's much easier to splash for an additional color than in other formats, depending on the cards that are in the packs. For example, in the current format, which is Foundations, you have these dual lands in booster packs. So these are lands that, we have seen this before, can tap for two different kinds of mana. This is Thornwood Falls. It would be an excellent pickup after you have picked up Simone, because it produces the blue mana and also the green mana. But it enters tapped, so it will slow you down. So, is it worth it to put Simone in your deck and adding Thornwood Falls? Is it worth it slowing your mana development down in order to increase this power level? It is your decision. You can have additional helpers like Land Searching. Campus Guide is a 2-mana creature. You can play it for 2 generic mana, so it has no color requirements. And when it enters, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, then shuffle and put that card on top. So if you're missing the blue, you will search for an island. If you're missing a green, you are searching for a forest. Very often in green there are creatures that can also tap for any color of mana. This is Paradise Druid, it's a 2/1, and it can tap and just add 1 mana of any color. So this is also something that you can use in order to provide additional colored mana to your deck. And understanding how to select your cards and how to prioritize your draft picks and build a deck so it enables these powerful splashes is a very rewarding skill. Understanding when it is worth to add additional colors, when it is not worth to add additional colors. Is your deck susceptible to having these speed bumps with these tapped lands? Or is it a little bit slower and can afford these kinds of bumps? Ultimately, it's for you to decide and for you to figure out. So the way I see it, the downside of the mana system, the way it is implemented in Magic the Gathering, is a punishment for becoming too greedy. Of course, also monocolored decks or perfectly constructed multicolored decks can flood out, can be mana screwed, can be color screwed. But this is the price that you pay in order to reap the benefits of the things that we have discussed. So why do I love this land system so much? Well, before the limited event, you don't even know which cards and colors you get to play with. So this adds a huge variety. The colors are the central aspect of limited deck building. You are looking for signals, you are looking which cards are the most powerful. Which cards are so powerful that I'm willing to fight over the color, even though I recognize that other people are also drafting this color. And that really is for me the most motivating and the most rewarding aspect of Magic Limited. Understanding the opportunities and costs of this mana system gives you an edge as a limited player when selecting your cards and building your decks. And this leads to a nearly unlimited variety, pun very much intended. So in my mind, MTG mana system has stood the test of time. They struck gold, they got it right the first time. Well, at least for me. And I very much doubt I would be playing Magic the Gathering if it was not for this limited environment that is fueled by this variety and this flexibility of the mana system. Exploring every new format, exploring the archetypes, exploring which ones are good, which work well together, which cards are good in one archetype and not the other, you play a blue-red deck and you play a blue-black deck and you want completely different cards from blue, for example. This is so much fun to figure out and there is so much to engage with. And this for me is why I'm still so passionate about Magic the Gathering Limited. Thank you for watching.